Let's go live to Governor Gavin Newsom talking about coronavirus and the budget deficit here in California.
But as you can see from this slide, not only was the state of California impacted by what was to come, but the entire nation and, of course, the world's economy. You can just see here in this chart, the U.S. recession that's been induced because of COVID-19, 26.5% decrease just in the spring in the nation's output. Just like that, almost a blink of an eye. In fiscal terms, certainly a blink of the eye, 60, 70, 80 days later, in a completely different position. Not just, again, the state of California, but the entire nation. The good news, though, for those that watch and follow the work that has been done here in this Capitol, work done by the previous administration, Governor Brown, the outstanding leadership that he advanced in terms of his fiscal stewardship of the state over the last 2 terms, combined with the talents and similar stewardship by legislative leaders, we enter into this moment in a much better place than we have previously entered into any recessionary moment. And I say that soberly, not naively, and I don't say that triumphantly. We are going to be dealing with challenges that we haven't faced in some time. But it is important to note, when we talked in terms of the surplus that we were debating last year, that operating surplus was in the range of $21.5 billion. That was last year's operating surplus that we were responsible for balancing. We debated that surplus, and we did a lot of things that I think make this situation a little bit better today. We paid down debt, the final $4.5 billion in debt from that wall of debt, the infamous wall of debt here in the state of California, that at the time it totaled $34.7 billion. The final payment was done last year, $4.5 billion, completely eliminating that debt. We were thoughtful, perhaps more so than even the last decade and a half, of using those surplus dollars very prudently, even more so than in prior years, where 88% of those one-time surplus dollars went to pay down one-time obligations or to invest in just one fiscal year's investment, meaning we tried to reduce the amount of ongoing expenditure substantially, thus the 12% reflected in this slide of new ongoing commitments. In budget terms, that is a fiscally conservative approach that we entered into last year, including, by the way, making commitments to pay down long-term obligations, pension obligations, not just paying off that wall of debt. That allowed us to increase our reserves to a record $16.2 billion. That was just one of a number of reserve accounts in the state. And I'll talk about not only that reserve account, but talk about a number of other accounts where we're able to put aside money, not just in that rainy day fund for a rainy day, but social safety net fund that we had set aside, some $524 million that was set aside in our budget under Prop 98 provisions for our public education system, including some economic uncertainty dollars that were set aside. A long-winded way of saying this: we weren't just asserting fiscal discipline, we were proving it, so much so that our bond rating increased twice last year and was increased to the highest level in over 2 decades. And as a consequence of that, borrowing costs for the state of California declined. It's a long way, again, of saying we're entering into this time of uncertainty in much better place than we entered into it in, for example, 2003. Or for that matter, 2009, or in more contemporary terms, 2011. We are in a position where I can advance at least a commitment to you that while the numbers have certainly changed, our values remain. And we are committed, despite the headwinds of a $54.3 billion budget shortfall that we are entrusted to balance in the current fiscal year and into the next budget year, to advance not only an effort to balance the budget, but also to balance our principles and to advance our values. And those core values, those core principles, I think are well reflected in the slide you see next to me. Public education, public health, public safety, and always an eye on people that have been hit hardest by COVID-19. I am not naive by any stretch of the imagination. While as painful as the state's budget may be, personal budgets for so many of you watching are even more devastating. You've exhausted your savings, your credit has been completely destroyed. You are desperate to get a sense of not only your fate, but our collective future. Some 4.6 million of you have filed for unemployment claims just since March 12th. We are at a time that's simply unprecedented. And when I mean unprecedented, we talk in terms of that Great Recession. That Great Recession, we had unemployment that peaked at 12.3% in the third quarter in 2010. Some 2.2 million people were out of work. I'll go back to what I just said. 4.6 million Californians just since March 12th have filed for unemployment insurance claims or assistance under our PUA program. 2.2, the peak in 2010. Now 4.6 million filing claims so far just since March. We are projecting in our documents we're putting out today in our May revise of that January budget that unemployment will peak north of 24.5%. One could argue we're already there. We are projecting, though, that as a peak. The budget year, we are projecting that we will come in roughly at about an 18% unemployment number. This is simply without precedent. These numbers, these unemployment numbers, the economic consequences of COVID-19 are not only being felt statistically, but they haven't been felt like this since the Great Depression. These are not normal numbers, even in a state so familiar with the vagaries of revenue, the increases and declines because the volatility of our tax system. These are simply without precedent in modern times. So the economic consequence is real, and that's why I just want folks to know that we are very mindful that while this may be an academic exercise, an intellectual exercise of balancing a state budget, this translates very differently to the folks watching that are trying simply to pay the bills, to keep their lights on, to be able to figure out some semblance of optimism about their capacity to get back to work and once again provide for their family and their future. Dreams quite literally being torn asunder in real time. Lives continuing to be lost, including 98 human beings that lost their life just in the last 24 hours related to COVID-19. These competing and confounding and compounding factors are front and center in terms of our consciousness and in terms of our mindset as we move forward to balance this year's budget. Let me now talk about this year's budget in more specific terms. The current budget proposal, the May revise that we're putting out, reflects a decline of 22.3% in revenue from the January budget. The budget we put out today is $133.9 billion general fund, some $203.3 billion overall budget. We're projecting a personal income tax, the PIT, as it's referred to in budget language, to decline by 25.5%, and corporate tax by 22.7%. But all told, in those three main categories, a revenue decline of over 22.3%. And so we start there. That's the baseline. No longer a projected surplus north of $6 billion, but now a projected deficit for the current fiscal year and the budget year that we are announcing and advancing here today of $54.3 billion.